Hey, while we're waiting here a moment, how many of you out there either unmute your mic or wave your hand or something? Is this your first meeting that you've attended with us?
That's me.
This will be my first.
Zach, is that you?
Yeah.
All right.
Bob Henderson, first.
Bob.
What?
Barnaby, it's his first. Yep, and he's got his headset on. Joe Dubner hiding behind his face. I like that, Joe.
Not my first, but it's been a while.
The other first timers?
Coy Bill. Wave.
Oh, hi.
Brandon?
Yeah, hey, I'm new.
Brandon. Brandon, are you in the area?
Well, I grew up in the Corvallis area, but I live down in Eugene, so I belong to the chapter here and the chapter up there. And I just met up with Kelly yesterday for the first time and checked out the simulator. That was pretty fun.
Oh, Kelly Wilson. Thank you, Kelly. I see you're on. Appreciate that.
Bill McCoy on.
Hey, Bill. All right. Any other first timers? We've got Zach, Bob, Brandon. Did I miss somebody?
Yes, Derek.
What I didn't do.
Yes,
Mike,
Derek.
Mike, this is Joe Dubner, and I invited a guest, Dave Tafola. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't see him here yet, but I gave him the links, and I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up. Hope we can make him feel welcome.
All right. Thank you. And I'm looking for, wait, there's a David. Hey, Dave. David. Yep. Are you Joe's guest? All right. Perfect. Thank you. And I heard an Eric.
Derek Peters.
Derek. Thank you.
Yeah, very inactive member. My job keeps me. I work every meeting. So
that's no excuse. You got to quit your job.
I'd love to.
There you are. I see you over there now, Derek. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got another good program, we think. And by the way, we're trying to, and Steve Sands has helped us out here. We're trying to kind of get a way that we can put all of our information together in terms of, how you can get this link information. Steve's got it up on our website. And so all this will do is it gets you to a link where it gives you all the information. But we've standardized the link, so we should be going, we'll hopefully be using the same link month after month. So the agenda today, we'll talk always as we do about etiquette a little bit. We'll hit our reports real briefly. If Mike Short's on, Mike, you with us yet? Yep, he is. All right, he's going to just do a quick little discussion. A quick bulletin from National. We'll talk about elections, talk about the newsletter. Ernie and Dave Ullman, don't want to catch you off by surprise. If Bruce Patton's on, we're going to talk a little bit about the chapter projects, our upcoming programs for the next 5 or 6 months. Then we'll have our featured speaker, and probably not use hints for home builders, because my guess is we're going to fill up our meeting. So as we've always, as we always say,
brevity, so yeah.
I'm sorry, did I miss something? Oh, somebody.
Yeah, it's just Barnaby. I'm not noted for brevity, so yeah, you'll probably use up the meeting.
That's why we're giving you the last 3 hours of the meeting, Barnaby. So no problem whatsoever.
Copy that.
All right. So the do's, to remember when you're not speaking to hit your mute button. And in some cases, I've actually muted some people that were making a lot of background noise. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just letting you know that there's noise coming in, and it kind of disrupts the speaker or the topic. So unmute yourself when you want to speak, and then and that's important. We want this to be somewhat interactive, so please feel free to speak up. And if you got something to say or a question to ask, especially during during Barnaby's section, you know, we wanted this to be as interactive as we can get. This is very much like flying around in the pattern on CTAF. You got to figure out when to get a word in, but you also have to kind of figure out how to let everybody else finish what they're saying before you speak up. So just consider you're flying in the pattern, and we're kind of using those same kind of rules. And we have a chat window, and if you want to ask a question, I try to keep an eye on it. Steve tries to keep an eye on it. So if you've got a comment or a question or something, feel free to type it in the chat window. Now, you can put questions to an individual who's in the meeting, or you can ask the whole group. So feel free to do either one. And we've always said this before, and our recommendation is if you have an alternative, please use a wired Ethernet connection. Wi-Fi can be hit or miss depending on where you're at. And so we're finding that if you have a good connection, you'll have a better experience with the meeting. And again, you know, we're all working through challenging times. We're all doing the best that we can to make these meetings productive and fun and effective. So just please bear with us. We are doing the best we can. So with that, we're going to hit our reports real fast, and we'll start off with membership. John or Rich, which one of you guys want to cover this?
Well, I guess go for it, Rich.
Right now we're sitting right at 171 regular members and annually paid members. We have 7 students and 24 lifetimes. So we've once again broken above the 200 membership mark for 2020. We're at 202 currently. And we still have 34 folks from 2019 that never renewed. So there's still some opportunity there, and we've got we seem to get the regular number of new members, either new to the area or first time coming to our group. So we're still a very active, growing chapter.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And I put this little graph up here, and I actually only started it in April because most of you may remember back in March we were up in the 230s or 240, but that included the members who had not paid for the year. So we made a conscious effort. We said we're not going to include non-paying members in our membership count. So that's why we kind of recalibrated. And we're starting over. So what you see here are paid members only. Okay, Vince, did you ever get any microphone working? Or because if Vince isn't talking, then
well, let's give it a try.
All right, yes, it works. Go ahead, Vince. You got to.
I have a brand new shiny Bimart webcam, and it seems to work. So not a whole lot to report. Let's see, what do we do? We have a new ladder, a new step ladder. I bought the heavyweight one so everybody can get on it. And they had 2 models. Within a week or so, I'm going to have disinfecting and mask stations at the entrances to the place, and so with some instructions about what to do and when, because we're going to try to encourage disinfecting your hands when you come into the place, and those who don't have a mask, we can provide them with one. Let's see, that's about it. Unless anybody has any problems or whatever they want to talk about with as far as the shop is concerned, I think most of the equipment is all running. I think the blades are actually sharp. Nobody's sawn any bricks lately with them. And so unless somebody has something contrary to that, that's about all I have.
And I would thank everyone who is kind of following the guidelines for wearing a mask while you're in the building, doing the social distancing. you know, I think we've made a lot of improvements over the last 60 days. So thank you very much for everybody who's helped us out.
Yeah, and I'd like to just reiterate what the rules are. If you're in the hangar work areas, it's mask time. There are some who don't want to do that. We can have a discussion about people who are working by themselves, but if you're within 6 feet or so, or 10 feet or so of someone, you should have a mask on. That's just kind of the way it is. In the meeting area, if you're around the table within a reasonable distance of the table and you're doing the coffee thing, then it's restaurant rules, 6 foot apart, and masks are not required. And that's basically it. And it's all voluntary. It's not that big a deal, guys. It's not like you're giving up your Second Amendment rights or something to wear a mask. So just let's kind of get to the program.
Thanks, Vince. Dave, how about youth?
Couple of things. The Zenith 701, which has been cowlless for some time, has a cowl in transit. So that airplane will be ready hopefully later this year for sale. It was built by our youth, and it will be completed for sale. We're planning on a teen aviation weekend, so I'll be picking on some of you to help with that, and that'll be later in the fall. That's in early planning. The only other thing I think that's it. Is Debbie on? She can do the scholarships.
Yes.
Oh, Debbie.
Okay. Exciting news. Kristen Taylor has been awarded the race scholarship for gliders. The value is $5,000. So that's really exciting. And we have a second candidate for a glider scholarship, and that is Zach Lopez, and he's joined us today. So we have 2 outstanding candidates and awardees for the race scholarship.
Awesome,
Excellent.
Tim. Thank you.
Also, we have Al. Do you want to give an update on the Saturday build?
I got to find Al. He may be there. He is. Go ahead, Al.
Can you?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I don't know if I'm in the field division or not, but we are working forward. I just talked with Pat a little bit about the potentials and what we have to do. We do to try in October to bring the kids very limited basis, probably 2 to 3 kids at the most, with a mentor, and then we'll split them into groups so that we can keep this group small, and we'll have a vigorous hand washing and mask regimen to go with it. And I don't know how much you can see in our field of camera here, but
I think your camera's off, Al. Your camera's off.
It is off. Okay.
Yeah. But that's okay.
We got audio, so we can listen and we can see all you guys. So we'll keep it at that. And yeah, there you go. There you go.
And I think, did you want to comment on starting to bring some of the youth build back in?
Yes, there you are. Hey, we just came up. So anyway, we want to bring some of the kids in. I've got to send out an email to them and let them know. Deb, I was looking for Zach's email last night, but I didn't see it just yet. Did you send it today?
I sent it last night.
Did you? I'll look again. Sometimes it takes mine a little time to get their emails through Google. So that's kind of the game plan is we'll work on the basis and be as careful as we can. And if it looks like it's not working for people, then we'll shut it back down again. But if we can make it work, we want to try and move forward.
Al, did you have anything you wanted to say about the RV-12 build? I mean, just in general, the project, or do you need help? Do you need, what do you need? Where are we at?
Well, right now we're going to have to reconfigure a little bit in the tools, so I'm going to be seeing John about tool replacements. The fuselage is actually doing fairly well. Pat and I are here working on it today.
We lost Al.
I don't know if you can see that. I just unplugged myself.
No, your camera is still off. Your camera is still off, Al. I think we have a technology.
I'm messing with things here.
I think you have to hit the icon in the corner that shows your camera view.
Yeah, we did that, and as soon as I did, it showed it on my end, but obviously it's not sending it out through the limited web.
Yeah.
There's one more hit that you have to hit after preview.
Hello? Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, somebody was talking, wasn't sure. Anyway, we have a fuselage moving along. We have a finished kit that I understand is 4 to 6 weeks out. So we're trying to get this box of parts put together. We'd really love to have the kids here to get them going on it. The finished kit's going to be real challenging for them. So the sooner we can get things up and running, the better off we are.
All right. Thanks, Al. Appreciate that.
I think that's all.
Okay, Mike. Mike Short, are you there? I had you on, and it's a long story, but you want to talk about safety and smoke?
I am here. So, hello, everybody. So, of course, beyond the obvious things about the smoke and the IFR conditions we have, once we start seeing the smoke subside, we want to keep in mind that smoke conditions can change pretty quickly with the winds and with the change in the atmospheric conditions, as it dries out in the afternoons and stuff. It's pretty easy to go from maybe VFR conditions with lower visibility into IFR conditions fairly quickly, and sometimes without even realizing it. I've had it happen a couple times to me where all of a sudden I realize, hey, I'm in IFR, it's time to get back out. So kind of keep that in mind. Mike said he's had a couple questions about engines and what the smoke and the ash and stuff can do, and I can't really answer those. Maybe some of you mechanics on board here could answer, but one thing from a pilot standpoint, on your pre-flight, I would double check that air cleaner, make sure that it's not filling up with ash, and also on the ground, don't be using carb heat on the ground. Only use carb heat as minimal as you need to, because carb heat is unfiltered air, so you're going to be sucking in some of that smoke and ash and stuff while you're doing ground operations and things. So I know we've got a lot of ash accumulated here around our house and out on the ramp and stuff, so we want to watch out for that getting ingested into the motor. That's all I really have to say about it. Just keep an eye out on those TFRs going east of here. It's almost one big solid TFR for the most part, up to 12,000, 10,000 and 12,000 feet. So it's tough even to go east. If you don't have ADSB, can't go over them, which means going around them. So, and watch out for water bombers and helicopters. So that's all I really have to say, Mike.
All right. Thanks. I'm going to skip over the EAA video magazine because we have some other things we want to get to, and Charlie didn't have a lot to say. I want to talk briefly about our elections. The elections are coming up in, they actually come up in at our November meeting, and all the positions are available. Now, the positions as a chapter that we vote for are president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and 3 trustee positions. So we have not had the door breaking down with people stepping up saying that they would like to take on a position. Now, in addition to the elected positions, we have what we call voting positions, and we have Vince. These are all somewhat appointed by the board. Vince is running facilities, That is a voting position. Dave Ullman's running youth. Ernie's doing builders. The fly-in right now is has been Steve Wheat, and that kind of is just because we don't have the flying going on. That's kind of an unstaffed. And then the budget, we have kind of an overall committee that is put together that runs the budget. And then we have temporary committees, as you might, they're pop-up committees as we need them. The hangar expansion, safety, the nominating committee, and so forth. So this is kind of how the board and the leadership runs, and the positions that we have currently. Now we're talking about adding a couple of new positions, and we're having some discussion about what those would be, whether those would be temporary, would be voting, how, what they would be represented. But the thing I want to get to you right now is we are going to be next month in October looking for nominations for these voted positions. And I need to ask everybody to think about this seriously. So not just for yourself, but somebody else that you think might do a really good job in representing the chapter and helping to promote the interest of the board. So we're not going to talk. I want everybody to be thinking about that, because next week we're going to open the floor for nominations. Any questions on that? Okay, let me see if I did this right. Newsletter, and I've got weirdness going on here, but that's okay. The newsletter, Rich is, as you know, we've been really doing a great job. Rich is our newsletter editor, and it's always interesting and great to have good content. Rich, you want to put in a plug for this month and next month and getting some more contributors?
Yeah, I mean, through the summer, or since the spring, actually, I think we've, as a chapter, have done a wonderful job of coming up with content to put into the newsletter. Let's keep it going. If you have any additional stories or reports on your projects, we'll accept flying stories or anything that you think would be of interest to our chapter members. Just go ahead and send them to the chapter Google email, and we'll pick up on that and get them included. So please, let's keep it going.
All right, thanks, Rich, and I'll just echo that. In these times where we can't get together and be social, the best thing we can do is still share, whether it's via video, whether it's by an article. If you have something that's interesting that you'd like to share, I will be happy to come out and work with you to put together a little video. You've seen some Mr. Gizmo videos. You've seen some other stories. So we're happy to work with you, especially during this time where we can't all get together, and we're looking forward to doing that. I'm going to hopefully not catch some people by surprise here. Everybody knows that we've got a builders group that is led by Ernie, and we've got a bunch of projects that are still happening in the background. And I'm going to ask Ernie to unmute his mic and maybe take us through the first couple, and then I'm going to ask Dave Ullman to comment on the Zenith project at the end. But Ernie, why don't you tell us what's going on with the pterodactyl and the coal?
The pterodactyl has undergone a total rebuild. Not a lot of money involved in rebuilding it. We've rebuilt the engine. It's running, and we're presently waiting for the wingtip bows from the manufacturer to complete this project, and then it will go on the for sale. And that will, once the pterodactyl is out of my hangar, we're going to bring the Kolb over and finish it up. We have a tentative buyer for it at this time, and we'll see how that works out. And we hope to have the Kolb finished, probably in the next 6 weeks to 2 months, and that'll also, if it isn't sold to this present person that's looking for it will go on the list for sale. That's it.
Thanks. Dave, why don't you, I know a lot of members have heard something about this Zenith project. Why don't you just kind of give us the background and share with the members kind of what the plan is?
We've been given a Zenith 601. This is different from the Zenith project that the students built, which was a 701. The 601 is a flying airplane. It was donated to our chapter because the guy is stopping flying, and he felt that his own chapter over in Bend couldn't really deal with selling it and managing it in a way that he wanted. So we've cut a deal. We actually met this guy through a short course that we put on how to maintain Jabiru engines. He came over for that course, and his name is Alan Smith. So we're in the midst of getting all the paperwork together and everything. So we'll be given this airplane. It's nominally worth about $35,000 according to comparables that are being advertised. If anybody's interested in the 601, we'd be happy to sell it to them. When we sell it, we're going to split the proceeds with his home chapter. We get a majority of it because we're doing the majority of the work, and somebody gets a really nice airplane. Ernie's been all over that airplane. It's really clean. It's got good equipment. It's got a Jabiru 3300 engine in it. Can you blow up the picture that you have there of it?
Maybe.
There you go. So it's a real nice airplane. If somebody wants an inexpensive way to own their own airplane, this is a really good opportunity. If you're interested in it, get in touch with Mike or Ernie or me. It'll be over here in the next few weeks, weather flying conditions provided, because it's a VFR airplane. And we need VFR conditions to get it here from Bend. But if you're interested, good opportunity.
And it's a currently flying aircraft with about 700 hours on it. It is flown regularly, right?
Yeah, it's a get in and fly airplane.
Yeah, this is not a project aircraft. It's one that's ready to go. So
it needs nothing except fuel.
Yeah, it has a small glass panel. It's actually next month we'll, assuming it hasn't been sold by then, we'll have some photos and we'll promote it a little bit. But yeah, so thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. Okay. So we got at least 3 of these projects that are going to be for sale: the Pterodactyl, the Kolb, and the Zenith. The Lancer 4P, which we're not working on currently, although Bruce Patton and I think maybe Denny had done some work on this even during this shutdown, this shelter in place. We do have a buyer contracted for that, and my understanding is he's being fairly patient, but we're going to have to get back on that. So just for those of you who are new to the chapter, the way that this works is that we accept an aircraft. We either build it, rebuild it, fix it, whatever is required, and then essentially flip it, and then those proceeds go back into the chapter. This is one of the main ways that we continue to put money into the coffers to keep the chapter going, and to then fuel our future activities. So we're always looking for good opportunities, and Ernie is our filter for that, so he decides what's a good project and what's not a good project. But just be aware, we've got a lot of stuff, and if you're interested in working on any of these, we can certainly use help. We have simple tasks and we have complicated tasks. If you're wanting to learn something about aircraft, working on aircraft, or working in composites, or working in tube and fabric, we probably can find something for you to do.
The other, Mike, if I can throw in one more thing.
Yeah.
These are good opportunities to get an airplane inexpensively that has been done right. There'll be no surprises on any of these. Ernie's a pain in the butt when it comes to inspecting things and make sure they're right. So you can count on the fact that any of these airplanes that you get, whether they're a student build, a flip, or we're building internally, you can be rest assured that they're done in a quality manner.
Thanks, Dave. So the next thing Mr. Gizmo submitted half of a presentation to me. We didn't get it completed in time, so that one we're going to probably bring back out next month. But what we want to talk about in general is we're getting a pretty good program queue lined up for the next several months. This week we have Barnaby is going to be talking about 7 deadly sins. Next month we've got John Monette, founder of Sonorai, founder of Sonex. He's going to be kind of doing a background. He's going to talk about Sonics, but he's also going to be talking about what he can of the Sonics aerospace program, where they've actually converted one of their designs into a UAV, and how and what was involved in doing that. So that ought to be really, really interesting. November, we've got the president of Fisher Flying Products for all you guys who've said, hey, we want to talk about low, slow, and cheap. Well, he's not only does Fisher have about, I think, 18 products in their portfolio, but they're bringing out some e-flight, some electric flight initiatives where you can charge your light sport plane up, fly it for an hour, and it would be ready to go again that in the afternoon, a few hours later after a recharge. So he's got a whole bunch of things. He's super excited about talking with us. We haven't decided on the December program yet. We're working on that. We have, the board's all over that one. So just FYI, we may have a regular meeting. We may have something that's more social. We're working on it. January, I think Dwight Hoover. Dwight, I don't know if Dwight, are you on? I don't see him. Dwight's going to present the 701. Some of you remember the 701 was donated to the chapter. Dwight purchased it from the chapter, and he's outfitting it with the Yamaha Apex power plant. That ought to be really quite a performer, and he's going to give us a project update on that. February, we've got Lightspeed, who's going to present. And then we also have made a connection with the Viking founder, Jan Eggenfeller, and he's going to present. We just haven't set him down for a schedule yet. So we've got a lot of good programs coming up. We want to get these promoted. We want you to know that we're working to find interesting materials for the programs. And if you have an idea, by the way, please let us know. Email, phone call, put it into the email, into the chapter, put it into my private. You can call me, call Jerry Price, call Denny Furman, call any of the, call Ernie, and we'll see if we can reach out, make the contact, and get that presentation lined up. And with that, we're going to be turning this over to our featured speaker, who is Barnaby Wainfan, and he is going to, if I can find him up here on there he is. And Barnaby, I'm going to make you presenter, so you're going to have to accept the token, and then there you go. You were the presenter, and then you're going to have to share your screen.
Okay.
Yay! It works.
Just click
Perfect.
share. Do you guys?
We can see it.
How truly good. Hold on. Arrange things for myself here.
Mike, can you make the image bigger?
I can't. I think, Barnaby, can you go to a full screen, or are you?
I am at full screen on the screen I'm sharing.
How about that? Does that help at all? Probably not. That's about what we're going to get, I think.
You can click on the right side there for the to blow it up over on the middle of the right side of the screen.
Yeah. The other thing to do, if you're showing all the people, all the smiling faces, you can get rid of them at the top, and it'll make his image bigger.
Yeah, you can slide that bar between your between all the cameras. You can slide that up clear to the top and make it small, and that will make his screen bigger. Or you can detach it entirely. All right, as soon as you're ready, Barnaby, I'm gonna mute myself. I'm gonna pretty well mute everybody else. So if you want to ask a question, make sure you unmute, ask the question, and then remute yourself,
Okay,
please.
Mike, what I would ask, and this is what I also ask at Oshkosh, you know, there's a lot to go through here. So if people would hold their questions to the end, and then if you would moderate that at the end, or, you know, let it go free for all there, because particularly in this virtual environment, it's almost impossible to take impromptu questions.
That makes total sense. Let's do that. We'll hold the questions to the end. Perfect. Thank you. Or put them in the chat room, and we'll come back to them when he's finished.
Yeah, that's the chat room was the way we did it when I did it virtual for EAA this year, and that seemed to work pretty well. And I will answer questions for as long as people have them at the end. So, okay, well, with that, first of all, thanks everybody for your attention. The subject for today, as the title shows, is the 7 deadly sins of airplane design. Get this working here. Okay. My name is Barnaby Wainfan. I am currently employed as a technical fellow at Northrop Grumman. I'm been in the aerospace business now for 41 years. Worked on a lot of airplanes. As you can see from this picture, I got my love of conventional configurations very early. I am sorry to say I have much less hair than that now, but nonetheless, you know, I've learned a lot in those 41 years, and I'm hoping to share some of it with you today. Here's just a quick snapshot of a few things I've worked on. Some of them will be very familiar to you, obviously. As of today, I've worked on 27 different types of airframe that have actually made it into the air, and I'm far from done. But the real subject today is about design. I do try to teach design, and what I found is that we spend a lot of time teaching people how to design things right, and where there tends to be a failure of teaching is in learning from the mistakes of the past. And so what the subject of today's talk is really about how it gets done wrong, so that we have the wisdom not to repeat those mistakes. And here's a few quotes just to get us in the proper mood. I mean, I hope that this talk helps a little bit for people to become expert enough without having to do what Professor Bohr, the lower right quote says, of making all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. And of course, one of my favorites is from Norm Howell, who's a retired U.S. Air Force test pilot and a good friend. Norm says that nature is the world's toughest teacher because you get the exam first, followed by the course. Of course, the other one of Norm's sayings, which isn't directly relevant here, but I've got to relate it, is that all the interesting in-flight emergencies start with a loud bang. Now, I disagree. My most interesting in-flight emergency started with a sudden silence, but, you know, Norm and I. And basically the reason, aside from the temptation to have a spiffy title for the talk, that I've done it this way, is that what you find is that failed aircraft programs tend to follow predictable courses. There are things we can learn from history about the way things happen that lead to programs that are not successful. And they tend to follow relatively repeatable scripts. And so what I've done is to group them. And I'm just going to page through these here. But what we're going to do today is we're going to go through all of these various ways of getting it wrong with some hopefully amusing case studies from history, and hopefully distill some wisdom from that. So if in future any of us find ourselves starting down these paths, we can say, okay, I know how this movie ends. It does not end well. Let's do something different. And so here are the 7 deadly sins themselves. The first is to have invalid assumptions in your specification, because every airplane starts from essentially a set of requirements. The second is if those requirements basically either over constrain or over demand from the airplane, and you basically have an answer that isn't within physics. Another one that's very common, I certainly see this in students a lot, and it's a temptation in the EAA world also, is to really come up with something that's completely dependent on the success of a new technology in order to work. And then, of course, if the technology doesn't work, you're in trouble. Likewise, depending on new engines has been the source of endless woe for airplane designers. Related to number 3 is number 5, and that is what we call hobby shop syndrome, and that is to try to put every innovation you can think of all in one airplane. It's also very tempting, if I look at number 6, to design to the very limits of what can be done, and then all you have to do is be wrong a little bit and it falls apart. And the last one is falling in love with a concept and letting the concept drive the design rather than the mission. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through all of these in order with a little more detail and with some case studies. So starting out with the specification. At the very beginning, before there's an airplane, there's a set of requirements. Because if you step back from the fact that we love the machine, every airplane is a tool to do a job. Now, it may be a very simple job, like get me off the ground on a bright sunny morning and let me enjoy myself without killing me. But that's still a mission. And it goes on from there to very sophisticated mission requirements. But once I have the mission, there's also something that in the industry we call the concept of operations, or the CONOPS. And this is, the mission is what we need to do. The CONOPS is how you're going to do it. So for example, if the mission is to transport an object from point A to point B, one concept of operations is to put it in a truck and drive it there. Another concept of operations is to put it in an airplane, in an airport, fly it there, and unload it at the airport. But those aren't the only ones. I could sling load it from a helicopter. If I'm feeling really racy, I could put it in a suborbital rocket and shoot it there, or throw it with a trebuchet. And some of these are obviously absurd, but there's a lot of ways of doing the mission. The point is that when we get started with the design, the engineers get given the mission and either evolve or get given a concept of operations, and the engineer designs to the concept, that the CONOPS that they're given. And if either the mission isn't doable or if the concept of operations is flawed, then you end up with an airplane that's the right answer to the wrong question. So for example, in the civilian world, the business case might not work. In other words, if the airplane's designed to make money for someone, or if you're trying to sell it to people to enjoy themselves with, the demand might not be there. Someone else might come up with a better idea, or it may simply be too expensive. In the military world, we care about, first of all, is the military mission there? Do we need to do that mission? How effective is the airplane at doing that mission? And then also, the famous saying, the enemy gets a vote. So if I'm doing a military mission, how survivable is the airplane in the environment that it has to do its mission? But in any case, what you end up with, if the CONOPS is flawed, is you can get either a program that's canceled because people realize we didn't really want to do that anyway, or it's too expensive, or an airplane that is a technically successful flying machine that turns out to be unsuccessful because it isn't useful. So one wonderful set of examples for this is the concept of multi-seat fighters from the World War II era. And there were many of them, and I'll talk about this magnificent beast, useless but very cool airplane in a moment. But if you go back to the era between the world wars, the great fear of military planners was vast fleets of enemy bombers coming overhead and laying waste to your cities. And it turned out to be a very valid fear if you look at the way the war went. And so an awful lot of thought went into how do we knock these bombers down? And one of the concepts, which actually sounds very much like 18th century naval warfare when you really think about it, was to have fighters that just had enormous amounts of firepower that would just get close to the bombers and just basically pour broadsides into them till they fell down. And one of the airplanes that was created to address this idea is the one on the upper picture, which I think is like the perfect refugee from a Bill Barnes pulp novel. I mean, it's 1920s, 1930s vision of an advanced fighter aircraft. It's called the Bell XFM-1 Aracuda, and it probably has more crew than any other fighter in history because it had a 7-person crew. Because if you look at this thing, it had a pilot, a navigator, a co-pilot, and the navigator was also a bombardier, because one of the things that isn't shown in the pictures, this airplane actually had a small bomb bay and it was supposed to try to drop bombs on the bombers. And then it had a gunner in each nacelle with a 37mm cannon, and it had 2 waist gunners. So the basic idea of this thing was to just get close and just blaze away with all this firepower. And they actually built 12 of these. They actually built a short run of YFM-1, and they had one brief service test squadron. But the airplane had multiple problems. I mean, it was advanced for the time. It had the first flying APU. It had early hydraulic controls. Biggest problem with it is it wasn't much faster than the bombers it was supposed to shoot down. And of course, if you can't catch them, you can't kill them. And then the other thing people hadn't taken into account was that people were putting defensive weaponry on the bombers. And so if you're flying with very little relative velocity from your target and you're shooting at him and he's shooting at you, the odds of getting a favorable exchange rate aren't real large. So the net result is they built 12 of them. They flew around for a while. They were all eventually scrapped, which in a sense is a shame. Wouldn't you dearly love to find one in a barn and restore that and fly it to Oshkosh? But as a military airplane, it was completely useless. Now, meanwhile, over in Britain, the airplane on the bottom was being developed. This one's called the Boulton Paul Defiant. And the Defiant was actually based initially on the concepts from a successful World War I fighter called the Bristol fighter, or the Brisfit. And the Bristol fighter was a 2-seat fighter in World War I that actually had considerable success flying over the Western Front. The big difference, as it turns out, the critical difference between the Defiant and the Bristol fighter was the Bristol fighter had both forward firing and rear firing guns. The Bristol fighter had fixed forward firing guns like a single seater, and then a tail gunner. And the way the Bristol fighter was fought, the real purpose of the gunner was not to shoot down enemy airplanes, but to protect the tail while the pilot flew as though it was a single seater. Whereas the Defiant, the concept of operations was similar to the Aracuda. That is that you would come up alongside the bomber, turn the turret to aim at it, and blaze away. So of course, the obvious problem once again is that the bomber also had turret guns. But the Defiant was actually committed to combat in the Battle of Britain and had a brief period of extreme success. And the reason it turned out was that from above and behind, the Defiant looked very much like a Hawker Hurricane. And so what the German fighter pilots would do is maneuver into a position where they could dive down on the Defiants from above and behind, at which point the turret gunners would tilt up their guns and go, "Hello, chaps," and give them a very warm greeting. Well, it took the Germans about 2 weeks to figure out that the Defiant couldn't shoot forward and wasn't particularly maneuverable, at which point the situation changed very radically. And what's interesting is this was actually foreseen once the Defiant was flying, because there's a report that I've seen excerpts from where when the Defiant prototype first flew, they sent it off to go do practice or simulated air combat maneuvering against a Hurricane flown by Sanford Tuck, who was one of the great British aces, it turned out, of the Battle of Britain. And Tuck, in deliciously British fashion, reported that the Defiant is an aeroplane that an enemy single-seater pilot will have very little difficulty dispatching the second time he encounters one. So he'd already figured out that the first assumption would be that it flew like a single-seater, and attacked from the rear, you'd get shot. But as soon as you figured out that it couldn't shoot forward, it was very vulnerable. So the Defiant was, in fact, withdrawn from daylight operations. It did, interestingly enough, have a second life as a night fighter, where the initial concept of operations worked relatively well. In a pre-radar world, at night, the idea of sneaking up close at somebody and shooting them works. And the Defiant actually held the line as a night fighter for quite a time until the radar-equipped Beaufighters and then Mosquitoes appeared on the scene. But fundamentally, both of these airplanes were, as effective military airplanes, doomed by their concept of operations, which there were things that were overlooked and therefore they didn't work very well. Now, in the commercial world, there tends to be a flawed business case. And the thing you see over and over and over again is a tendency to take what's already being done or what's already important and extrapolate it to the point of complete failure. So if you go through these various ones, I mean, SSTs, and interestingly enough, the idea of supersonic business jets and so forth is coming back again. And they're all based on the idea that what the airlines were selling was speed. And if you look at it up until the 1960s or so, that was a perfectly valid assumption. Each generation of aircraft was faster than the one before. Originally got people flying was it was a lot faster than trains or ships. And so the idea was the next step after the 707 and the DC-8 was to go supersonic. And the customer base were people for whom time was important and money wasn't. And what ended up happening about the time the SSTs were being developed, the first generation SSTs, is the world changed. Because first of all, the high bypass turbofan and wide body airplanes came along, and that made flying subsonic much cheaper. And secondly, it turned out that subsonic airplanes were fast enough that for most trips you could still get where you wanted to go within a day. And we would have a little bit of useful day left at the end of the day. Now, this was obviously in the world before the TSA, but nonetheless, you know, on a subsonic airliner, even if you're going, you know, Los Angeles to New York or something like that, you're talking 5 to 6 hours. And so the speed advantage of the supersonic airplane was much, much less, and the cost was much, much higher. So it turned out that, you know, the only SST that did any prolonged service was the Concorde. They only built 16 of them. And while there was you know, great prestige in flying them, they didn't make any money for anyone. And of course, the developers lost an enormous amount of money because when you think about it, it costs so much to develop an airliner that you have to sell 250 to 400 airplanes to break even. And the fundamental reason was people will stop buying speed at any cost and started buying enough speed at the lowest price they could get. If we go back in history to once again near the end of World War II in Britain, the British convened a committee led by one Lord Brabazon of Tara, which I gotta love that title, to figure out what kind of aeroplanes the British airlines would be flying in the post-World War II era, and undertake the design and construction of those, put out RFPs basically to British industry to create those airplanes. Now, sadly for the British, we now know the answer to that question, and the answer is American ones. But what happened is the Brabazon Committee actually said we're going to need 3 different kinds of airplane. And one of them, which is not on here because it was successful, was a short to medium haul turboprop. And that turned into the Vickers-Viscount, which was the first successful turboprop airliner and actually had a pretty good service life. But the other 2 were intended for long range flight. And the one at the top, which was named after the great man himself, was supposed to go transatlantic nonstop, you know, in the piston engine era. And the basic idea was that, once again, we're talking about rich people. They want to be comfortable. So the idea was to have almost Pullman car-like comfort within the airplane. So they built this utterly enormous airplane. It had a 220-foot wingspan, and it had 8 engines, 8 Bristol, I believe, not Proteus, Centaurus radial engines. The wing on this airplane is so thick that those radial engines are actually mounted vertically inside the wing behind those air inlets. And they had this amazing set of gearboxes to drive coaxial contra-rotating propellers. So each one of those stalks is driving 2 propellers with 2 engines. And this entire monstrous beast could carry 100 passengers. There's lots of good video on this out on YouTube, and it's impressive to see, even though it was a relatively useless airplane, because at the time, Bristol was developing in this airplane on the other side of the ocean. Boeing was developing the 337 Stratoliner, Lockheed was developing the Constellation, and Douglas was developing the DC-4 and later the DC-6. And those were airplanes that, while they weren't quite so comfortable, carried a lot more passengers and went a lot faster. So in the end, the economic proposition on the Brabazon failed completely. And so it's a little sad actually to look at the YouTube videos, because you start with, there's the old British Pathé videos, and there's the video that says the mighty Brabazon takes to the air for the first time, and then about 5 years later there's video of it being scrapped, being dismantled, and the announcer sadly saying, after an investment of umpty-ump pounds of taxpayer money, all that remains is this pile of scrap as the end of the Brabazon program. The other one that they developed, and once again, an impressive if useless airplane, was based on the idea that, before World War II, the British actually served there with flying boats, and the Americans, Pan Am was flying flying boats also. And this was because there weren't very many airports, and the way to get a big long-range airplane off the ground was to fly it over water, and there were lots of places where you could land in water. So the logical extrapolation was to build an advanced flying boat for BOAC. And they came up with the airplane that's at the bottom here called the Princess, and a really impressive airplane. This is a 10 turboprop airplane. Once again, you can see the inner stalks have coaxial counter-rotating propellers, and the outer stalks have single props. And once again, 10 Bristol Proteus turbines all inside the wing, pressurized, one of the first all-powered flight control systems in the world, and actually over a 300-knot airplane. So as flying boat airliners go, a very impressive airplane. What they, of course, had not paid attention to was the fact that during World War II, people had developed lots of good long-range land planes and built lots and lots and lots of airports for the war effort. So the need for a flying boat really wasn't there. Once again, there's video of this flying, and if you look, you can find a video of it making a knife-edge pass down the field at Farnborough, and it's really impressive because the airplane's about 2 wingspans above the ground and banked up nearly vertically. Now, it turns out, I read from memoirs of Jeffrey Quill, who was Saunders Road's chief test pilot, this was not intentional, because the airplane had one of the very early all-powered flight control systems, and it had an artificial feel system that used dynamic pressure and some base, so the pilot couldn't overstress the airplane at high speed. And Quill got the airplane going quite fast, got a good head of steam up, banked the airplane vertical with the intent of rolling back level again, and then discovered that the artificial feel system had generated so much force that he couldn't move the ailerons. And to quote him, he was a quivering bootful of top rudder away from the biggest smash in the history of Farnborough. He eventually managed to use differential throttle to get the nose back up and get the airplane slowed down, and then rolled level and went away. But it ended up making for a very impressive pass. But they built 3 Princesses, only one of which flew, and one wrong technically with the airplane. It worked as designed, but it wasn't actually useful to the end user to make money. This type of mistake didn't go away 50 years ago. We're seeing the end game right now of yet another flawed ConOps extrapolating to failure, once again in Europe, with the Airbus A380. The basic concept behind the A380 was that, at the time they started it, long-haul airline operations were hub and spoke. You went from big airport to big airport, and then people would get on smaller airplanes to go off to wherever they were going. And that was the efficient way to do it. That was basically the business model for the 747. The other idea was we're not building any more runways, so the number of takeoff and landing slots at these major hub airports is finite. Because air traffic control can only handle so many, and particularly with big airplanes, you need a certain amount of separation for wake turbulence. And so the basic idea was that they needed a very, very big airplane to accommodate the increased amount of passenger traffic, because at some point you were going to saturate the hub airports. There was also a bit of prestige at having the biggest airplane. Well, what ended up happening, of course, was that the airplane was too large for most airports, and they actually had to do a lot of new infrastructure for taxis and gates to accommodate it. Most of the airports didn't want to do that. Now, interestingly enough, that issue has reappeared with the Boeing 777X, which is why Boeing is now flight testing an airplane with wingfold. The 777X actually has the outer few feet of each wingtip fold up on the ground so it can use standard taxiways and gates. The other problem with the A380 is it's a big, expensive airplane, so it's only profitable if you can fill it. And then another airplane appeared on the screen, as it were, on the scene, which blew up the business model. It was really interesting to see because at the time that Boeing, A380 went ahead, Boeing actually canceled a derivative of the 747, and there was much lamentation in the United States about how we were losing the lead, and the Europeans are going to have the biggest airliner, and isn't this terrible? But what Boeing put their effort into was the 787, which, because it was a very fuel-efficient airplane, and to some extent 777 derivatives also, what those airplanes do is they make point-to-point operations profitable again. And so the hub and spoke model fell apart because it turned out it was economically superior to fly somewhat smaller airplanes direct. And as soon as you can't fill the very large airplane, it becomes an economically unsuccessful aircraft. And if you take a look at what this did to Airbus, you can see that, if Airbus didn't have lots of cash available to it from reasons other than selling airplanes, it probably would have put them out of business, because it cost about $25 billion to develop this airplane. And the interesting thing is they never reached what, in the trades they were calling break even, but they had actually redefined the word break even because the production rate fluctuated all over the place to mean that they were actually charging more per airplane than it cost to build. So they were actually, for most of the production run, taking a loss per airplane that they delivered, which means that they didn't recover any of the development cost, any of the non-recurring cost at all. In February 2019, they announced the end of the program with an extrapolated 251 total airplanes delivered. By that time, some of the airlines were already retiring their A380s, and of course the current pandemic situation has accelerated that. So the net result is that this program will end up with about 250 airplanes having gone into service, and probably led to a net loss of something like $30 billion for the people who developed it. And all basically because the business model didn't hold together. And to sum all of this up, I give you the words of Sir Robert Wall, who was of Bristol Aircraft, who was their chief engineer at the time. He said this: he worked on the Brabazon program, and he said, and this is the comfort to the engineer: if the customer orders the wrong airplane, that's not your fault. And referring to the Brabazon, in this case, the customer ordered the wrong aeroplane. So, right answer to the wrong question. Another thing that can happen is that you can over-constrain the design. You can either ask it to do too many things or put too many limitations on it, and all of those things affect the airplane, and it becomes difficult to impossible to make an airplane that will actually meet all those requirements and do the mission effectively. One good case study for this one is the F-111, which ended up actually being built in various because it wasn't a total failure, it was a partial failure in some respects. But the original idea for the F-111 was that it was going to be an airplane that was going to be operated by both the Navy and the Air Force. And, for those of us who are students of history and are watching current events, some of this should sound very, very familiar. It was a program called TFX, Tactical Fighter Experimental, one of the amazingly many things Robert McNamara got wrong. And the idea was that one airframe was going to fulfill multiple missions. It was going to be the fighter and interceptor for both the Air Force and the Navy. So it was going to do intercept, counter-air, fleet defense. And it was also going to be a strike aircraft for both the Air Force and the Navy. And the basic idea here was, because it was a common airframe, you were going to get enormous economies of scale and make it cheaper for everyone to build a force structure. I'm sure some of this sounds familiar, even if one reads current events. But if you take a look at what that meant for the engineering of it all, you have all of these requirements. First of all, the airplane was required to be supersonic at sea level, 1.2 Mach at sea level. And the loads on the airframe are just ferocious for that. At the same time, it had to go a long way subsonic and have long loiter for fleet defense. It had to be carrier suitable, and it was a 2-crew aircraft, and given the state of the avionics and the equipment at the time, it was decided that you needed to have good crew communication, which led to the following engineering decisions and requirements. The reason the airplane ended up being a swing wing of variable geometry was because the high-speed, low-altitude mission is incompatible with the subsonic loiter and range mission for the same geometry. If you're going fast at low altitude, you need a slim, highly swept, high wing loading airplane, like a delta wing. If you're trying to go longer subsonically, you need more span, lower induced drag, and a higher lift to drag ratio. And also, you're not going to get a slender delta on and off a carrier. They decided that you needed side-by-side seating for good crew communication, and in order to have low enough drag to be a good supersonic airplane at low altitude, bury the cockpit for flush seating. It also put some requirements. All of these requirements made the airplane very heavy. One of the requirements was for the crew to be able to successfully eject at Mach 1.2 at sea level, and of course the dynamic pressure there is ferocious. So it was one of 2 aircraft to end up in service that actually had an escape capsule rather than ejection seats. The whole cockpit ejected as a unit. The other airplane that did this is the B-1 with very similar requirements. And of course, the high dynamic pressure at Mach 1.2 at sea level made the airplane very heavy. So how did all of that turn out? Well, the Navy airplane never saw service. It was too big and too heavy to ever really achieve carrier suitability, although they did manage to do some demonstration takeoffs and landings on carriers. I believe the Navy version actually got up to close to 80,000 pounds launch weight at some point. The aircraft also proved to be completely unsuitable as an air-to-air fighter, because the fighter doctrine here, and once again this gets back to CONOPS, was that you were going to be shooting beyond visual range with missiles. Well, as what was learned in Vietnam and other places was that fights still go to the merge, and the maneuverability and visibility out of the airplane are still important, and the airplane was useless as a dogfighter. I mean, first of all, you can't see out of it, and second of all, it was heavy and high wing loading, so it really didn't have much in the way of energy maneuverability. Because the requirements actually drove it so strongly in the direction of the strike, it actually had a long and successful career as a strike airplane and as a bomber, but as a fighter, it was useless. So various interesting fallouts there. First of all, the Air Force ended up flying a Navy airplane as their primary fighter for many years, because the Navy was already flying the F-4 Phantom, which was a pretty decent fighter, and the Air Force didn't have anything coming along other than the F-111, so in the end they ended up buying F-4s, and the F-4 became the multi-role, multi-service airplane. And in a funny way, the F-111B, the Navy version, ended up being the ancestor of the F-14 Tomcat. And there's a very interesting story about that that's relevant to this, that was related to me by some of the old Grumman guys, and I later heard it from other sources. Because, you know, I always wondered why the F-14 was called the Tomcat. After all, you know, Grumman had this history of naming their aircraft after ferocious predatory cats. So you had the Hellcat, the Bearcat, the Wildcat, the Cougar, the Panther, the Tiger. And why was the most ferocious cat in history the Tomcat? Well, it turned out it's because of the F-111, because at the time of the F-111, the chief of naval aviation was a gentleman named Admiral Tom Connolly. And Admiral Connolly knew that the F-111 was completely unsuitable for naval operations, and he basically made it his mission to keep the Navy from having to accept it. And so there's a story told that Admiral Connolly was testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the chairman was saying that, was questioning him and basically saying, well, Admiral, we understand that with the current engines, the airplane's a bit underpowered, but when the new engines come along, that will fix everything, won't it, Admiral? And Admiral Connolly is reported to have said, Senator, there is not enough thrust in all of Christendom to make a fighter out of that airplane. Now that statement is widely believed to have been the death of the F-111 as a Navy airplane, and also to have cost Admiral Connolly another star and a seat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So when the Navy started developing the Grumman fighter they really wanted, and it was going to be a Grumman airplane, it was going to be a cat, they started calling it Admiral Tom's Cat. And eventually that was shortened to Tomcat, and the airplane was officially named basically as a tribute to Admiral Connolly holding the line and making sure the naval aviators got the airplane they needed. Another quickie, this one, once again from Britain, and I'm not slagging on the Brits, by the way, but they did an awful lot of interesting things over a lot of history. I mean, any country that brought us the Vulcan and the Spitfire can't be all bad in the aviation world. But here's an example of where one little constraint ruined an otherwise good airplane. This is the Short Stirling bomber, which was the first British four-engine bomber that was actually committed to service. And part of the specification at the time was that it had to fit in a standard RAF hangar that was 100 feet wide. Well, if you look carefully, you can see that they pushed it to the limit. The airplane had a span of 99 feet 6 inches, so they probably put it in the hangar once to prove it could be done. It's an otherwise very good airplane, but unfortunately, and even if you look at the pictures, you can see the wings look a bit stubby. It turns out that because the span was so short, the airplane had a service ceiling that was quite a bit lower than some of the later four-engine bombers, and that was just low enough to get it down into the lethal envelope of ground-based AAA. So once again, committed to combat over Europe, took pretty severe losses from ground fire, particularly in daylight operations. Even in night operations, it got hit pretty badly compared to the Lancasters and later, the American bombers. And so was eventually withdrawn from service over Europe and used for maritime patrol and things like that. But this is an example of a case where one single constraint took an otherwise good airplane and created a critical vulnerability. Interestingly enough, these kinds of things haven't gone away either. If you take a look at U.S. Air Force fighters, they all have a span of 42 feet or less, and that's because the standard USAF hardened shelter is 44 feet wide. So far, that hasn't caused an airplane to turn into a failure, but once again, engineers are still faced with designing to those kinds of constraints. Okay, moving on to something depending on new technology. We always try to advance the state of the art, and a new technology, if it works, can give you a great advantage. But if it fails and the project is dependent on it, you end up the whole airplane fails. And of course, we tend to be optimists. This is one of the other things that's a theme through all of this. We're all optimists at the beginning of preliminary design, and then get our steady doses of reality until we're at, okay, now does this thing still work? So if it's not an experimental program, if it's a program where the airplane actually has to work and go into service, it's very important to have a plan B if the advanced technology doesn't pan out, or at least be aware that that could happen. Case study here, this dates back to the early 1970s, at a time when, and once again, this is another kind of overlapping sins, the ConOps that was being developed, people believed at the time that in the future, which is what to us now is the relatively recent past, military aircraft were going to go all STOVL or all VTOL because runways were too vulnerable. And so there was enormous amounts of work being done on developing VTOL fighters and other aircraft. When I came out of engineering school and started my engineering career, the Navy believed that the big deck carrier was dead and they were going to have smaller ships called sea control ships, and they were developing two types of aircraft, type A VSTOL, which was going to be a fighter, and type B VSTOL, which was going to be a patrol aircraft to replace the S-3. And this aircraft here was an X-plane being developed to develop a whole new system of generating vertical lift. It was called the XFV-12. It was being developed by Rockwell. And the basic idea here is that you would take the hot gas from the single engine, duct it out into the wings, and then it eject it through nozzles built into all of those Venetian blind looking things in the wing called augmenters. And these augmenters would entrain a large amount of other external air, greatly increasing the mass flow and greatly increasing the static thrust. And this was a way of getting enough, ideally getting enough thrust to take off and land vertically without having to grossly oversize the engine. And I remember seeing pictures of this airplane in Aviation Week when I started engineering school. I thought, wow, that's a cool configuration. And they rolled it out, and then they announced when the first flight was going to be, and then the first flight didn't happen. And then they announced that they weren't going to try to take off vertically right away, but they would take off conventionally and fly around and test the augmenters. And then that didn't happen. And then the whole thing quietly faded away. And in fact, the airplane never flew. Because here's a picture of it sitting on the thrust measuring rig at the VSTOL rig at NASA Langley with all kinds of smoke emitting from the ejectors. Well, unfortunately, what ended up happening when they got to full scale is somehow the ejector system didn't translate from the lab to the full scale airplane very well, and they didn't get the augmentation they thought. And the net result is with the engine at thrust and the augmenters augmenting as much as they could, the airplane had a thrust to weight of less than 1. So it has the singular distinction of being one of the few jet fighters ever built in history that literally would not fly. And when they couldn't get enough thrust to hover, and looking at the landing gear geometry, they decided there was absolutely no good whatsoever in trying to fly it conventionally, and the airplanes were quietly shuffled away. I don't know whether they still exist in some dark corner of a dusty hangar somewhere or whether they were scrapped. And there were a lot of theories as to why it failed, including integrating the ductwork, changes of the geometry of the augments. We'll probably never know unless some Rockwell engineer writes memoirs or leaves information in behind. But in the end, the whole program was based on the technology, and the technology didn't work. But sometimes you have a situation where you have no choice but to try to use new technology. Sometimes you get a mission specification where you have to invent something to do it. And then basically you're betting your program on making the new technology work. And a good example of that is the Joint Strike Fighter. There was this great NOVA years ago called Battle of the X-Planes, which describes the development of these two aircraft, the X-32 and the X-35, and then the down select and competition to become the Joint Strike Fighter. It was of particular interest to me because I know a lot of the people involved. I actually ended up working for one of them. But basically, if you look at this from an engineering viewpoint, each of the companies, because the airplane had to be a short takeoff, vertical landing supersonic fighter, made a bet on a new technology. So Boeing decided to stay low risk on their propulsion system. They said, what we're going to do is refan basically an F-22 engine, an F-119 engine, to increase the mass flow and increase the static thrust. We're going to use a proven Harrier-style vectoring nozzle system and direct lift because we know that works. That somewhat limited the amount of vertical thrust they could get, so they ended up having to make an airplane that was very light. This is the reason for the low aspect ratio delta wing configuration. And frankly, even though the airplane is not one of the most beautiful things to ever fly, if you look at the structural integration of the airplane and some other details of how it was done, it's a very clever design for trying to build a structurally weight-efficient airplane to keep the weight down and still get the aerodynamic performance. But that didn't quite get them where they needed to get, so they were going to use a new thermoplastic resin system in the wing skins to save weight in the wing skins. But the manufacturing process was immature. This big thermoplastic skins hadn't been built, and they tried to build skins and they couldn't get it to work. So in the time they required to meet the program schedule, they couldn't build wing skins with the new resin system. So they ended up building their skins for their demonstrators out of what we would call today's standard composite materials, which were a good bit heavier. And the net result is they had essentially zero lift margin in the vertical mode. They did in fact succeed in just barely meeting the vertical requirements by taking the airplane to Patuxent River to do the Stovall demonstration and stripping it of everything, including, I am told, the actuators for the variable geometry nozzle and a whole bunch of other things. So the version that they did the vertical takeoff and landing with was actually not capable of flying very fast or going supersonic. In the meantime, Lockheed decided they wanted to stick with conventional structure and a conventional configuration. I mean, if you look at the X-35 and then the F-35, it basically looks like a baby F-22. And they were going to put their technology bet in the lift system. So what they decided to do was to go with a shaft-driven lift fan. So there is a fan behind the cockpit that is driven by a shaft that takes power out of the core of the jet engine. Nice low-risk idea, right? I'm going to take tens of thousands of horsepower out of the engine in a gearbox and clutch system, move it 11 feet forward on a shaft to run God's own Cuisinart behind the cockpit. But that fan system made about 10,000 pounds of vertical thrust. And they made it work. And so the result is they ended up with an airplane that had a much higher thrust margin for vertical takeoff and landing. So at the same time as Boeing was just barely doing their VTOL demonstrations at Patuxent River on a cool day at sea level with the airplane stripped out, Lockheed was doing their STOVL demonstrations at Edwards Air Force Base in the summer with an all-up airplane. And the final thing Lockheed did, and this is really, really smart marketing, they completed all the customer required demonstrations, and then the day after that, they flew an unrequired demonstration mission that they called Mission X, where they took the X-35 out on the runway at Edwards. They did a propulsion-assisted, extremely short takeoff, a combat-style STOVL takeoff with the high lift system running, took off, climbed to altitude, accelerated supersonic, came back and did a vertical landing where they took off. And they demonstrated the entire thing end to end. And in the end, that's what won them the program, and that's what won them the Joint Strike Fighter, is their technology that they bet on worked, and Boeing couldn't make the advanced technology they bet on work. Particularly interesting because if you would step back and look at it from first principles, you would have probably bet that Boeing could make theirs work a lot easier than Lockheed could make theirs work. Now moving on to one of my favorites, never bet your program on a paper engine. The cartoon was drawn by a dear friend of mine named Aldo Spadoni, who's also a brilliant avionics engineer. And if you look, you should really look up his stuff online. He's a brilliant aerospace science fiction artist. Now that he's retired from Northrop, he sells some just stunning stuff. But Aldo drew this for me, and I love the the look on our poor pilot's face there. But the real point here is that unless you're building a glider, the success of the airplane depends on the success of the engine. And the engine has to perform up to snuff. And if the engine doesn't deliver either in weight, thrust, fuel consumption, or reliability, the airplane suffers and may, in fact, turn out to be either useless or not meet its performance guarantees at all. It's also a caution for airframe designers that you never design an airplane to the ragged edge of what the engine is supposed to be able to do, because aero guys and airframe designers are optimists too. And if the airplane ends up heavier or higher drag than predicted, which they almost always do, and you're designed to the limit of what the engine can do, you're going to end up falling short in performance. So a case study here is one those of us who have been going to Oshkosh for years will recognize. It is, in some respects, one of the examples of Barnaby's law of aviation startups, which is the probability of success of the company is inversely proportional to how big their tent is at Oshkosh when they go up with their non-flying prototype or mock-up. And, I think people remember Eclipse showing up with this enormous pavilion and this airplane. But here's the basic idea behind the Eclipse. It was a very light jet intended for air taxi operations and personal use. And it was based on an engine that was being developed by NASA. A couple of years before the Eclipse appeared, Williams and NASA brought in a scale-built airplane called the Williams V-Jet to Oshkosh and announced, and this, when NASA still put a good bit of money into general aviation-related programs, that there was a new program called GAP, General Aviation Propulsion, and Williams was going to develop a 500-pound thrust turbofan engine that in full series production would cost $40,000 a piece. Well, you know, a whole lot of people declared the miracle had occurred, that the piston engine was dead, and you know, by 2005 we would all be flying jet bonanzas, and only a few puddle jumpers and people flying antiques would still be using piston engines. Well, a year or two after this was announced, Eclipse shows up at Oshkosh with this airplane, which had not yet flown, and announced that they had acquired a 5-year exclusive contract from Williams to use the Gap engine, now being called the Williams EJ22. It was never really well explained how it was legal or possible for a single private company to lock up exclusive use of something being developed on a government program, but that none the case, they somehow managed to do it, which tells me that in future, if I ever do an aviation startup, I'm not going to hire Eclipse's engineers, but I might hire their lawyers. But in the end, what happened is the engine did not produce the rated thrust in time. And in fact, here's a picture of the Eclipse prototype 500 Echo Alpha, and it only flew once with the Williams engines. I read an article in, I believe it was Aerospace America or Smithsonian Magazine, the Smithsonian Aerospace Magazine, that during the development of the Eclipse, FedEx actually had stationed a caravan at Eclipse's home airport because they were tired of paying the fuel for repositioning costs for the almost daily flight to take burned out engines back to Williams and bring new engines back to Eclipse to continue the flight test program or the test program. In any case, in 2002, have flown and supposedly, once again, it was reported that when this airplane made the flight that this picture was taken, the Williams engines were actually producing 50% of rated thrust at full power. So the pilot actually committed to a takeoff with an airplane where the engines were producing as much thrust as if he was trying to take off with one engine inoperative, which is pretty scary, but they needed to get a flight off by a specific day to get a big tranche of funding. And so apparently they persuaded a very brave, if not entirely wise person to make the flight. So in any case, in 2002, Eclipse terminated their contract with Williams, went into Pratt & Whitney and switched to the Pratt & Whitney 600 engine. Pratt & Whitney 600 engine had higher thrust, was a good working engine. And then the dominoes started to fall. Because first of all, the program is now 3 years behind schedule. The price of the airplane has now risen because originally Eclipse claimed that with this magic engine, they could and some good manufacturing technology, they could actually deliver the airplane for less than $1 million. By the time they actually had a certified airplane to deliver, it was 2.1 million and rising. Higher thrust engine, which of course burns more gas. So even with the modifications to put tip tanks on it and an 850-pound gross weight, 18% gross weight increase, they still were 12% down on range from the original projections. All of which, of course, makes the airplane less desirable. But the most important thing is their business case fell apart because part of the whole idea behind Eclipse was that they could offer a much cheaper airplane with these new magic engines, and that was the reason to buy an airplane from a startup company. Once you're competing with Cessna, delivering an airplane which is powered by the same engines as the Cessna, because Cessna developed the Citation Mustang around the Pratt & Whitney 600 engine, the 600-pound gorilla is back in the room. And, you know, business jet operators and private jet operators, the thing they care most about is reliability and dispatch rate. You know, they care a bit about cost, they care a bit about fuel burn, but they want their airplane to be ready to go when they want to go. Those airplanes are for on-demand transportation. And of course, with Cessna, with a Cessna product, because they're very good at it, they build reliable airplanes and they've got great service. And you know, if you're deciding to buy an airplane, that 5 years from now, if I'm down somewhere and my left outboard flap actuator is broken, I can call Cessna and have one there in a day and get my airplane back in the air. And I don't even know whether Eclipse is still going to be in business. So in the end, you know, the business case for Eclipse fell apart. leading to this very long tail of woe. Eclipse, the original Eclipse delivered 259 airplanes, a lot of which were in an interim configuration because they were developing the avionics, they were developing a lot of things. So they actually couldn't fly their full, some of them weren't even IFR legal when they were first delivered. In 2008, Eclipse went bankrupt and a new company bought the assets basically to support the owners. Just to add insult to injury, in 2011, there was an AD on the Pratt & Whitney engine, which fortunately was eventually relatively quickly resolved. And this Eclipse Aerospace was trying to get to the point of building airplanes. I don't believe they ever finally did succeed in delivering new airplanes. And they were eventually merged into a company called One Aviation, which was developing both an advanced version of the Eclipse and a turboprop airplane called the Kestrel. And then in 2018, One Aviation went bankrupt. Now, I read about a week ago that One Aviation may in fact have found a buyer, and so we may see yet another iteration of the Eclipse. But at this point, we're somewhere between $2 and $3 billion into this saga to get about 250 airplanes into service. And it all goes back to the fact that the whole program was dependent on the promises of an engine. Moving on, once again, temptation, EAAers do it, students do it, sometimes big companies do this, is to put all the cool new stuff in one airplane. And so it's not uncommon to see an airplane, and certainly if you read history, that's not only got an unconventional configuration, but it's using a new and different engine, different materials, and unconventional controls, and you name it. And the problem is each one of these adds risk. And it only takes one of them failing for the whole program to collapse. And, so the real lesson out of that is use the innovation where there's a chance to get a big benefit. And otherwise, stick with conventional practice and just make it work. Ironically, by the way, just a story from my history, if you look at the Facet Mobile used very conventional materials and what I believed at the time to be a very conventional propulsion system because I was taking a lot of risk with a radical configuration. Well, of course, the great irony for me, it was the very conventional propulsion system that failed and put me through a fence. The radical part worked great. But nonetheless, a quote from Freeman Dyson, and this rings very true for me because I'm an engineer who was raised by two scientists. Both my parents were research scientists. Is that a good scientist is a person with original ideas, while a good engineer is a person who makes a design that works with as few original ideas as possible, because that's the low-risk design. So here's a case study, and once again, this is slightly forgivable because it was an experimental airplane, but they tried to test everything at once. This was the Lockheed X-33, which was a test vehicle to prove technologies for a single-stage to orbit space launch vehicle. And if you look at this thing, it had a huge number of innovations in it. It had a type of engine called a linear aerospike that had never been flown before, a whole new type of rocket engine. It had composite cryogenic tanks for the liquid hydrogen. It had a whole new metallic system for thermal protection and a new lifting body aerodynamic configuration, all wrapped up into one. In the end, the airplane ended up getting about 3/4 built, and then it was put in storage and never finished. And the primary reason was two things. First of all, the configuration changed. The configuration for the operational vehicle evolved along the way, and there was a lesson in there in that the basic original X-33 configuration didn't really balance because it had a heavy engine in the back. And of course, when you're launching with all of the tanks full of fuel, the center of gravity is in the right place and it's stable and away you go. Problem is you burn all of that fuel out, and on a single stage to orbit vehicle, that fuel is something like 95% of the launch weight. And the payload's another percent or two of the launch weight. So when the airplane's coming back, it weighs single-digit percent of what it did on launch, and all of the weight that you have burned off is at or ahead of the CG. So it ends up very tail-heavy. And it didn't, in fact, balance for the glide back at all. Now, for the demonstrator, they said, no problem, we'll just put some ballast in the nose. Of course, that changed the weight fractions to the point where it would never actually be a successful orbital vehicle. But they thought it was worth flying suborbitally to develop the technology. But what happened is that the the operational configuration, those little stub wings, I don't know whether you can see my cursor or not, but these little stubby wings up here just kept growing and growing and growing until the original lifting body was just a little point sticking out of the wing, and the airplane ended up looking much more like some of the Willy Ley Mars glider kind of things from the 1950s. But what finally killed the program is when they were testing the cryogenic liquid hydrogen tanks, and they failed in testing. And even though they had some aluminum lithium tanks coming along, they basically decided that it just was going to be too much, and the configuration wasn't going to work anyway. So they said, never mind. Related to that is a design margin. It's very tempting when you're starting with a new design to eke every last tiny little bit of performance out of it everywhere, and to design right to the very limit of what can be done. Well, if you have to do that to get an airplane that meets your design specifications, you're probably going to end up falling short, because there's a lot of ways that you can end up doing not as well as you wanted. The airplane can almost always ends up heavier than predicted. Sometimes the engine doesn't produce as much thrust. Sometimes it burns more fuel. Aero, the drag may be higher than predicted. And even if you get everything right, your customer will always want to add more payload after you build the airplane. So what it means is, when I design an airplane, I want to make sure that there is some margin, so that I have ways of either the airplane can do a little bit more than it was designed to do, or there's straightforward ways of changing the airplane to get that extra little bit to meet the requirements as these things happen. Now, this is one of the reasons why the conventional wing body tail airplane actually has for so long, is it's relatively easy to change. You can put a bigger wing on it, you can put different flaps on it, you can put a bigger tail on it. The potted engine arrangement is great on the airliner world, because you can take those engines off and put bigger engines on. There's lots of ways to change that airplane. Now, with some of the advanced configurations we're playing with these days, the highly integrated, blended ones, it's much harder to do. And so you have to have the margin designed in from the beginning. And a case study for that is the A-12 attack airplane that was designed for the U.S. Navy. I have a certain amount of personal culpability in this one, because the A-12 program actually started as a result of an unsolicited white paper from Northrop that I helped write. And it led to a competition in which the Navy eventually chose the other guy's airplane. There's a good book about this program written called The $2 Billion Mistake, which I highly recommend, because it's a great case study in how not to develop an airplane. In any case, General Dynamics and McDonnell made promises that they could do things that Northrop was not willing to promise they could do. They got the contract, and then it turned out they couldn't do it. Because basically what happened with this airplane is, as they started building, it ended up much heavier than they predicted, because they were very naive about what could be done with composites. And if you look at the configuration, there's literally nowhere to go with this configuration as the weight starts to grow, because it's a pure triangle. You can't put a bigger wing on it. It is the wing. You can't change the sweep angle, because everything's integrated, and the wingtips will hit the island if you do. Because it's a tailless airplane, there's no way to put more flaps on it to get more lift. And so they were stuck. And eventually the weight of the airplane, the predicted weight of the airplane, grew to a point where the wind over deck required to launch it exceeded the top speed of the carrier. And at that point, the program was canceled, and it was actually canceled for default. And the amazing thing is, the program was canceled for default, and the lawsuits over it went on until 2 or 3 years ago, at which point they were finally settled. And one of the great ironies in this is that General Dynamics in the lawsuits actually had the cheek to claim that the Navy should have known that they couldn't build it at that weight because the Navy had Northrop's proposal, and Northrop was more experienced with composites, and Northrop's proposal showed that the weights that General Dynamics predicted were not achievable. But in the end, the program was canceled, and the A-12 never got beyond a mock-up and several partially developed airplanes. And you know, it's very, very indicative of how you have to have margin and have an integrated configuration possible. One of the big problems with the A-12 was that it had no good load paths, you know, because it's a highly integrated configuration. It carried all its payload and its engines internal. So if you look at this picture, I won't go into great detail, but that orange area in the center there is all holes. It's doors. It's bomb bay doors, weapon bay doors, gear doors, engine doors, and you know, holes don't carry load. So they tried to carry the entire spar load on the green areas. So you're either chasing the load all the way around the back of the airplane or all the way around the front of the airplane. And they just couldn't pile enough material on to make it work. And in the end, it just got too heavy and the program was canceled. And as I said, you know, this was a very, very expensive mistake, and it all started because Northrop wrote a white paper saying we can build a baby B-2 to get on a carrier, and the government decided to compete the program instead of giving it to Northrop individually. So I guess I can claim to have helped start one of the worst debacles in the history of American aircraft procurement, but it wasn't my fault. Okay, getting on to our last one, and this is once again very common in EAA and common in other areas, is falling in love with a configuration and letting the concept drive the design instead of the mission. And the reason this is done is because people believe the concept offers some vital advantage. And at some point, preserving the concept becomes more important than the suitability of the configuration for the mission. Now, you know that the advantage may be real, but sometimes it either doesn't apply to the mission very well, or there are offsetting disadvantages. So even though it does the thing that people believe it does, there are other things it does that are worse. And one warning to a designer is if you start having to make lots of compromises in your design to keep the concept pure, like, for example, having to put in movable ballast to make a weirdly configured airplane balance, or as we'll see in a moment in the case of the Starship, having to use a variable geometry canard and invent a new flap system. The concept is probably trying to tell you it doesn't want to do what you're at, and it's telling you that it's not suitable for the mission. And this is you know, an issue that's gone on in history, because it seems like every era there's a magic configuration that everybody thinks is the answer to all problems. So I'm going to just flip through a couple in history without going into any detail. But if we go back to, for example, World War I, we had triplane fighters. And once again, sometimes some of these are successful, but they also have drawbacks that cause a short life. So World War I, we had triplane fighters. More recently, the aft tail pusher concept. And once again, you guys will probably recognize most of these airplanes. A couple of them actually met their performance numbers, but weren't particularly successful commercially, and a couple of them were total disasters. Lots and lots in history on canard business airplanes, and we'll get into that in more detail in a moment. And more recently, a lot of interest in what people are calling a blended wing body, which is sort of a flying wingish configuration. Once again, none of these configurations are first order stupid or a bad idea everywhere, but they have areas where they may offer an advantage and areas where they're not, and it's very important to make sure the mission drives the design, not the configuration. So the last bit of this talk is going to be a case study about such an aircraft that actually made it into production and then failed rather spectacularly. And I want to preface this by saying that, some very well-known and very smart people were associated with this program. And I'm only doing this case study as an example of how a program can get away from you. And this is in no way intended to be critical of or to put down the brilliant people who found themselves involved in this thing and gave it their best to make it work. So the basic idea here. This is the Beach Starship, and the basic idea was that Beechcraft was building the King Air, and they wanted to get into the 21st century with a very advanced new business turboprop to replace the King Air. And so, they went to scaled and ended up with the design for this airplane called the Starship. Now, I've heard the story that this is not really the configuration that Burt Rutan really favored the most. He really wanted to do a 3-surface airplane, but because Beechcraft had already seen drawings of the Piaggio Avanti, they wouldn't let them do a 3-surface because they were worried about proprietary data issues. I don't know whether that's true or not. I know Burt later did do a 3-surface airplane called the Triumph, so there may be some credibility to that. But in any case, the whole idea here was, it was going to be an all-composite airplane. The canard configuration would supposedly take the advantages that have been demonstrated with the Long Easy and pusher engine installation to make everything quiet and efficient. And so I'm not going to read all these, but these are all the advantages that were originally claimed for the configuration. Well, how did it turn out? Well, if you just look at numbers, not very well. Both of the airplanes had about the same useful load. The Starship had 41% more power than the King Air, 700 horsepower more, and that brought 4.5% or 13 knots in cruise, and that's if you believe the manual. At the same time, the Starship was 20 knots faster stall speed, which is not good. It took over 1,000 feet, over almost 1,300 feet more runway to take off, and 500 plus feet more to land. So if you simply take a look at this and say, I'm presenting, the head of the aeronautics department of any business with the pilot's operating handbook for these 2 airplanes and deciding which one to buy, and the Starship costs more, it's a pretty straightforward decision. So how did that happen? Well, a lot of it can be found from first principles, and this is the first bit of mathematical aero and only bit of mathematical aero geekery I'm going to subject you to. It turns out that lift to drag ratio of airplanes, the aerodynamic efficiency of airplanes, is correlated strongly with the ratio of the span over the square root of the total wetted area of the airplane. And this is actually a correlation plot, and you can actually derive this from first principles, which I promise I won't do to you today. But you can and this correlates very well with real airplanes. So here's a plot I actually use it at Northrop as initial performance predictions, and you'll see each one of those spots plotted is a real airplane, and they group by class because different classes of airplane have different skin friction because of different surface quality and so forth. But if you plot the King Air and the Starship on this, you can see that just from first principles, just from the 3-view drawing, the Starship could be expected to be about 10 to 15% worse in aerodynamic efficiency than the King Air. So that's not a real good start. But if we work that down once again into the weeds, you can see that the Starship had 350-ish square feet more wetted area than the King Air. So it was worse on that parameter. Also, because they were not able to get the weight savings they expected from the composites, it was almost 2,000 pounds heavier. And one interesting thing is when they started the Starship, the actual FAA max gross weight limit for an FAR Part 23 certified airplane was 12,500 pounds, which you can see for the King Air. Well, partway through the Starship development, the FAA increased that to 14.5, and I can only attribute that to lots of lobbying on the part of Beechcraft, because if Beechcraft had to fly the Starship at 12.5, it would essentially have no useful load, or it would have half its useful load. And so what it turns out is that because the useful loads are the same, the useful load fraction of the Starship is less too. It's carrying less of its takeoff gross weight as useful load. So the Starship, in addition to being aerodynamically less efficient, is basically for the same payload toting a ton of extra airplane around. And it turns out that the transport efficiency of an airplane is directly correlated to the product of useful load fraction times lift to drag ratio or span over the square root of wetted area. So from first first principles, you can see that you would expect the Starship to be about 3/4 as efficient at transporting payload as the King Air. And a matter of fact, if you go do the detailed numbers, that's exactly what happened. And the sad thing is this is all knowable from first principles and could be used essentially to disqualify the concept from the start. And then they ended up, and I feel for these guys, they ended up getting bit by a lot of secondary things. Once again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what they ended up with the composites is that they tried to use composites in areas where composites weren't the lightest solution, because composites are very good for areas where there are high concentrated loads and you need high stiffness. They have high strength to weight there. But composites can't be allowed to wrinkle or bend because they crack. And so anywhere where you're sized by minimum gauge, composites get heavy. And also because composites are brittle, the FAA requires a higher factor of safety. They require a factor of safety of 2 on composites as opposed to 1.5 for metal. It was an early composite design, so they were very conservative. So in the end, the airplane ended up heavier in composites than it would have been if they built it out of metal. And then once again, another lovely cartoon from Aldo. They got bit by a bunch of surprises caused by the unconventional configuration. And I'm going to go through all these pictures just to show you all the things that ended up. But one of the first things that happened is the Starship had a very interesting high lift system. Because the flaps are all the way in the back, you can't trim much flap with a canard without it pushing the nose down. So it was arranged with a variable geometry canard, so the canard swept forward as the flaps came down to compensate for the nose down pitching moment for the canard. Of the flaps. Well, it turns out that the FAA requires you to stall the airplane not only in approach configuration, but in cruise configuration. And in approach configuration, you got the classic canard pitch nod. That is, as the Long Easy's famous for. The canard stalled first, the airplane pitch nod, self-recovered, everybody's happy. But it turned out when you swept the canard back, it changed the aerodynamics of the canard enough that the main wing stalled first and the airplane pitched up. And the FAA said, that's not acceptable, you can't do that. So they ended up putting vortilons on the wing to cure that pitch up. And they were successful. And they also ended up putting stall strips on the root of the canard to make it let go at a slightly lower angle of attack. And everybody's happy. Then there is an FAA requirement that says you have to go to max altitude and be able to sustain a 45-degree bank at max gross weight at max altitude without stalling. And so they got up to altitude and the airplane in its new configuration got into a canard pitch nod, which is safe. But the FAA said, no, that's a stall. So they ended up putting vortex generators on the canard to increase its maximum lift in the cruise configuration to hit that corner of the envelope, obviously at considerable cost in drag. So first they had to make the canard stall earlier, then they had to make it stall less, and in the meantime they had to make the main wing not stall so much. So they got caught. Meanwhile, the airplane was falling short of its cruise numbers, and somebody figured out that because of the way the flow went around the strakes, going through the propellers kind of sideways, and they had actually towed the engines in to reduce one engine inoperative yawing moment, to reduce the amount of rudder required to fly the airplane with an engine out. Well, they figured out that for the drag problem, the propulsive efficiency problem, that they had to tow the engines the other way. So they changed the position of the nacelles, got a considerable improvement in thrust, and discovered now that they weren't making VMC. So they ended up putting vortex generators on the fins to add rudder power to make minimum control speed work. The last one, and this is the only one that I really can't conscious, when I saw the airplane at Oshkosh the first time, I saw this spoiler, essentially, this fixed spoiler ahead of the main landing gear well, and I asked the Beechcraft representative about that, and they said, oh yeah, there was this very loud rumble in the cabin with the gear down, and we put that molding on there to cure the rumble. Well, the problem is it's not retractable, so it's sitting there in front of the propellers all the time. And so as they added all these things, of course, this all added drag, and the airplane's performance went down and down and down. So in the end, they built about 50 airplanes. Most of them were not sold. Most of them were leased. I think only 12 to 14 of them were actually delivered to a customer who paid full price. After a while, Beach decided they didn't really want to, as the airplanes started to come back from lease, mostly from people who ended up buying Premier business jets, they didn't want to support this orphan fleet of airplanes. So they brought in all the lease airplanes, and they bought back as many of the privately sold ones as they could get, and they took them out to Everett Valley Airport in Arizona, and they scrapped them. So here they are all, which makes them, I guess, beached crafts, but they are all there waiting to be scrapped. There's about 5 Starships still flying, and one of them is owned by a gentleman who believes that the end of the Starship program was a terrible sin against all that is good in aeronautics. And he actually went to the scrapper and bought all of the spare parts and systems from most of the airplanes they scrapped. He's got a hangar full of parts that are probably enough to keep his Starship flying for 100 years. So I'm not going to go through all this, but the real message here is that if you look at the concept from first principles, it was actually inferior to the airplane it was supposed to replace. And by falling in love with the concept, they lost sight of what the airplane was really intended to do and ended up at great expense producing an airplane that didn't perform as well as the conventional airplane it was supposed to replace. And so with that, a few bits of distilled wisdom. These are Barnaby's rules for designers: is you design for function, not design features, because a well-formed design beats a bunch of fixes flying in formation every time. That said, details do count. It's possible to scrap a good design with bad details. One lesson from the Starship is you never, ever show a customer a configuration you do not want to build. If you show a customer 4 options, and option number 3 is a gratuitous straw man that you absolutely have no desire to build whatsoever, but you wanted to make sure it looked like they had a lot of choices, I guarantee you that is the one they will pick, and you will have to try to make it work. Like I said, there's a bit of story that the Starship was that. Most problems warn you. So what looks like a negligible problem today is the seed of tomorrow's disasters. So fix it now, because you can't fix it later once the airplane is built. In the modern airplane world, there's a belief that you can cover a multitude of sins with programming a flight control system, but really you can't fix it in software either. And no matter how good you are at telling a story, nature doesn't read PowerPoint. So you can have a fabulous briefing, but it doesn't make your airplane work, because fundamentally the universe does not care about you, and physics don't change no matter how much you want it to. And with that, I will give you my attempt at a pithy quote about such things, because we're playing with serious stuff, and that is: physics is not mindful of your wishes nor tolerant of foolishness. And yes, that is me in person learning that lesson the hard way during my adventure on Junkyard Wars. And if you look very carefully at this picture, you can see a whole lot of physics in play here. I did walk away from this completely uninjured, by the way, but you can see the puff of dust being kicked up by the thankfully very stout tube I had ahead, which saved my ankles. You can see the shoulder harness, the wisdom of wearing a shoulder harness. It's saving my face. And for you structures geeks out there, you can see perfectly symmetric Euler buckling of the tubes behind me. But in the end, because it happens slowly, I lay under the remains of the airplane for about 5 seconds and then shrugged off the flakes and walked away from it all, a wiser man, if somewhat disappointed. And that brings me to the end of what I have prepared. If anybody's still awake, and if I haven't bored you to tears, I will be glad to answer questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Barnaby. Hey, I have a follow-on question, and it's kind of a multi-part, and we'll let you ramble a little bit. Clearly, you are associated with the Facetmobile. You've worked with the group here at Independence. Where does the Facetmobile fit into this, and what are kind of the plans? What are you guys talking about for futures?
Well, as far as a deadly sin, I don't think it is one. I think it was a reasonably successful program, except for a poor choice of engine. And of course, the one that's being built here in Independence is not going to repeat that mistake.
We hope.
As far as future plans, obviously, I'm looking forward to seeing the one that's in the hangar here fly. And I'm hard at work on the detailed design for a Light Sport 2-place successor that I'm calling the FMX7, which has already flown in the form of an RC model. I've got a lot of good wind tunnel data on it. It's an airplane that should exist. And if my current plans pan out and fate is kind, I hope to be cutting metal on it early next year.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Hey, anybody else out there, make sure you unmute your mic. I'm sure Barnaby can take a few questions. We're running over a little bit, but that's okay. I don't think any of us have anywhere to go.
Yeah, so I have a point.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so the point of the Starship that you left out is it's probably one of the coolest looking planes ever built. And you may say, well, cool doesn't sell planes and all of that, but I guarantee you high heels are not comfortable to wear, but every girl in the world wears them for years and years and years. So even a piss poor design can prove to be a success in financing or whatever.
Well, you know, I'm going to shy away from the risk of addressing your example directly in today's times, but
my wife's not here. I could say anything I want presently.
I understand, but I'm on a hot mic with a recording going, so I admire your courage, sir. But that said, there is no doubt that cool and aesthetics and the brochure sell some. But in the end, the product has to deliver. So if it is an image product, cool sells. I mean, you see it, or status sells. I mean, if you see it in the automotive world, right? Most of what we buy for cars isn't the performance of the car. Almost everything you spend for anything above, say, a Toyota Corolla is for comfort, image, or cool. You know, for maybe a personal airplane where it's just you flying around, yeah, cool sells big time. But for an airplane that's used day to day to perform a utility function, cool sells if you are compared to a less cool but roughly equivalent airplane. But it doesn't, as we saw with the Starship, overcome the poorer performance and higher cost. And in essence, though, I think the cool is probably what lets people get sucked in and continue farther down such a program than they perhaps should. You know, as the performance is starting to fall short, maybe even before the airplane's built and flying. If it's a cool airplane, there's a tendency to say, yeah, but it's so cool. Let's see if we can make it work because it should. So it's a bit of a trap also.
Yeah, I would say all of us appreciate how much information you just gave out. That was a lot of different directions and things that I never would have thought of. Really appreciate you doing that for us.
Thank you very much. You know, the one thing, and I said it at the beginning, but let me reiterate it, and this is the thing we tend to lose sight of, and even, you know, very experienced engineers are guilty of this. You know, is to fall in love with the machine and be dazzled by the cool factor. And, you know, we have to remember that what we are creating is a tool to do a job, and that its virtues are only really virtues in the context of doing the job it's designed to do, particularly if we are selling it to someone. So, you know, I can sell pure cool if the job of the tool is to make the owner look good or feel good. But if the job that the owner needs to do is actually to transport stuff or, you know, conduct a military mission or make money, then that's the most important thing, and cool becomes much, much less important.
Hey Barnaby, we got a couple of questions in the chat. So Eric, if you want to unmute and ask your questions, feel free.
Hi, Barnaby. I've really enjoyed your talk today, and I was wondering if you've published any books, articles, or videos about design and engineering.
Books, articles, or videos about design. At the moment, you know, what you can find is my monthly column in Kit Plains. In terms of publishing articles, there's been one column a month since January of 1988, so that's rather a large body of work. I also have a little book which is strictly about airfoils called Airfoil Selection that you can buy from Aviation Technical Book Company or Wix. And I am just undertaking, starting to gather up the entire wind tunnel, which is the title of my column in Kit Plains library, and organize it into a coherent form for a book to come out sometime in the future. It's a very big job, but it's actively underway.
Excellent, thank you.
Any other questions out there for Barnaby?
One other thing is a couple of my talks are also online on YouTube. If you look at my website, which is wainfan.co, not wainfan.com, but wainfan.co, there are links to, I believe there are links to a couple of my other talks which are out on YouTube. Or if not, you can on YouTube and search my name, and you'll find, I believe, 2 other talks similar to this one.
Excellent, thanks again.
Jerry?
Yep.
Yeah, one quick one, Barnaby. I appreciate you coming to talk to the chapter. I personally, and I think probably a lot of chapter members would be interested in some of the history and design considerations that went into the FMX, both the original model, the evolution we've got on our hangar, and maybe future designs. So just putting a bug in your ear. Certainly not the next meeting, but we'd sure like to.
Well, you know, I mean, when we can find the appropriate time, I would be glad to do that. In the meantime, if you need a bit of a fix, my 2019 Oshkosh forum on exactly that subject is out on YouTube, and you can go watch that. Obviously, some developments since then, but that'll at least give you a good taste.
Probably it makes sense, Jerry, for when this one flies, when Bob's flies, that we do my guess is there's going to be a lot of publicity on it, and it would be a good time to come back around and regroup and have that discussion and presentation. Just
absolutely, but I work for this tyrant that's always after me to chase down content. So.
Content must have
we'll
content.
Find a way to make it happen, guys. I'll let you guys figure out the timing and the desirability, but you know, I'm in.
Well, hopefully you'll be within easy reach of us if everything comes to pass. So, and we're wishing you well on that endeavor as well.
You know, that is devoutly to be wished, but not as certain as I had believed it to be a little while ago, but still working in that direction.
We understand. We understand. Anybody on the call, if you want to sell your house, Barnaby is looking in the air park area. So just FYI, not that we're trying to move anybody out, but he is actively pursuing residents. Anything else? Anyone else? Any last questions? Or otherwise, we're going to wrap this puppy up. Well,
yes,
right.
This is Gary.
Go ahead.
This is Gary Madison here. Barnaby, will you make your presentation available to 292 members for today?
I mean, if you've recorded it, yes, certainly for members. If not, you know, I did do essentially a similar version of this for EAA in July. So if you can go back to, you know, their Spirit of Aviation days, something very similar to this. It's not identical, but it's very close, is online.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we have no other questions, oh, did Bruce, did you raise your hand there? Nope, he's waving me off. Okay, everybody, thanks for a great meeting, and we'll be getting back together in a month, and we've got VMC coming up in a couple weeks, and then remember we've got John Monette and the Sonics information coming up in October. So take care, everybody stay safe. Hopefully we'll get some clear skies and be able to get our planes out here pretty soon. So take care, and we'll see you in a month.